I can't quite believe it's been over a year since I made a wrap-up video. Like, the last one I made was March 2015, so this is a little bit weird for me, but I've got plenty of things to talk about. April was a pretty good reading month for me, and that's actually pretty rare recently since I started working full-time. I've not been making a lot of videos because I haven't got a lot of time with my job, and I haven't been reading a lot. I've kind of like lost the motivation to read. After a long day at work, it's kind of just so much easier just to come home and put Netflix on or watch something on TV. But I've been reading a lot of comics recently and I've been really enjoying them, and it's getting me back into books. I have read 4 books and 8 comic volumes in the month of April, so combined that's like 12 books. That's very, very productive for me. So I'm not going to talk about them all. I'm going to like bind them up into series for the comics, and then I'll talk about the books individually. So the first book that I finished in April was The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. This is a modern classic that a lot of people really like. I know a lot of female readers really like this. There's plenty of big booktubers that really like this, but I kind of thought that it was okay. It wasn't anything to rave about. I personally don't think there's anything to rave about. I'm not going to reread this. This book is realistic fiction. It's about the life of one girl and her journey through adulthood. And she's a young woman when we start off, and she's living this very glamorous lifestyle. And it's basically about what she gets up to as a young adult, but she has a lot of promise in her life. She thinks a lot of great things are going to happen to her. She's very bright, she's very beautiful. She has a lot of very good friends that are very successful too, and when she leaves her internship, things don't quite go to plan and her life falls apart, and she goes through a bout of bad mental illness. And it's something that I think a lot of people can relate to, having high expectations as a young adult and then things don't necessarily go to plan and you start to feel very down, or you don't know, the future looks very bleak, and you do get mentally affected by it. I could kind of see a little bit of myself in this person. Like, I went to university twice and then I've left, things haven't gone my way, and I've had some pretty personal struggles. So in a way I could kind of relate to that, but I don't think a lot of people are going to relate to this. But that was the element of the book that I liked about it, that was very realistic. It wasn't glammed up. It wasn't trying to create a fantasy life, a perfect life for this girl. It was all about how her life wasn't going to plan and the effects that that was having on her life. So I would recommend people reading this who are about my age, who are about 22, 23, because it is very realistic. It does get quite dark towards the end and it turns very psychological, but if you enjoy things like that and you don't like sunshine and rainbows, then I think you would like this. But it just wasn't really what I was looking for to read, and I actually read this in a day because it's not actually that long and can be read in one sitting. So that was the first book that I read. I rated 3 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. The next book that I also read in one sitting in one day, is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. I probably butchered that, but I can't be bothered to say that again. I've had this book for a very long time. I've owned it for about a year now, and I sometimes struggle with historical fiction because I did history at university and that was very hard, and I don't want to relive that through books. Like, I wanted to read something modern and up to date and not get bogged down in the past, if that makes sense. I did the Holocaust at university, and that was one of the most emotional experiences of my life, having to write essays about this. So I usually avoid books set in World War II about the Holocaust, but this is very different. This is actually wrote and set from a German girl's perspective, and I don't usually like books with children in it because I don't really connect with children. I don't particularly like children. They're not my kind of thing. But I really enjoyed the protagonist of this story. She's called Liesel. She's 9 years old and she lives in Germany, and she gets fostered by a German family. The mother comes across as very not loving towards her, but you can tell that she cares, and the father is absolutely brilliant. And eventually into this story, there's a young German man who goes to live with them, and it's all very emotional, and there's a lot of big events in this. There's also a boy in the street who is signed up into the Hitler Youth Program, and all of the characters have struggles. There isn't much in the way of high points for any of them. It's very upsetting. I did cry at this. A lot of people I know cried at it, and it's really highly recommended by everyone. It is very different to everything else that is out there set in World War II. So if you enjoy the time period, I really recommend this. And if you feel like having a good cry, I'd really recommend this. The characters are so well written, there is so much plot, and you really feel connected and like you are there, which for me is quite rare in a book. So I really enjoyed this and rated it 5 out of 5 on Goodreads, and I would say if you have this on your shelf and you are putting it off because you don't want to read a sad book or you don't feel like reading a historical book, that you should read this soon. It's actually a really quick read. I was surprised I was able to read it in one sitting at least. The next book that I finished in April was The Fifth Wave by Rick Yancey. I actually started this in February, and I only got around to finishing it midway through April after I'd read 2 great books, because I really struggled with this. I was really in the mood for a YA, supernatural, alien type book, but for some reason this just didn't connect with me at all. I wasn't really a fan of the main character. I didn't really like much about her. It didn't read like she was a teenager. I can't really explain it, but I didn't like any of the other characters in it so much too. I actually thought it was very dragged on, and it's surprisingly a really big read. Like, this is 450 pages, and I really appreciate the length of it actually, because not a lot of young adults are very long, and it did have a lot of story to it, and it did have a lot of detail, but I really struggled to finish it, and for the length of it, thinking about it, it didn't really have that much going on. It was quite predictable. And these are all unpopular opinions, but it just wasn't for me, and I'm not going to carry on with the series, and I am going to get rid of this one. And if I thought that 450 pages was a long read, I have no idea why I chose the next book that I did, because this book comes in at 1,325 pages, so just over 1,300 pages long. But I enjoyed every second of it, and I give it 5 out of 5 stars, and it is Stephen King's The Stand, but I read the uncut edition, which is the edition that came out 20 years after The Stand was originally published, and it was basically the initial version of the story, because upon publishing, a lot of the story was taken out to make it shorter for publishing. I think that this works really well. I really like the length, I really like the depth. I think it's needed, because the characters are, you know, when you watch a TV show like The Walking Dead or Breaking Bad, and you spend so much of your life watching these characters and their stories unfold, and you've got the image of them in the head, and you know their personalities. You don't really get that from a lot of books, but you do from The Stand, because there are so many characters, but so much time is dedicated to each character, and they're so much different. This is essentially a book about characters. The overall plot is that there is a government-made experiment, a disease that gets out of hand and it spreads across America, and it is very apocalyptic. But I think I have too much to say about this book, so I'm actually going to make a separate video about this, a review. But I do really like this. I've rated 5 out of 5 stars. If it wasn't so long, I would definitely read it again. And even though it's so long, the length should not put you off. This is a classic. This is a very epic read, and I can see this being absolutely timeless, and people will still rave about this in years and years and years to come.